Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. It's lovely to be here and lovely to see everybody engaging in this. So I'll be doing a kind of a brief overview of 101 of what Freeports are, what they claim to bring in terms of benefit of jobs, investment, boosting trade, etc. And what I feel is the reality of what trade ports kind of are, what they exist to do, and chiefly kind of who they're set to benefit. So the first question is really that of kind of what are free ports? Are they something that is going to level up the economy, or are they part of an agenda that will race us to the bottom? Well, free ports are a specific type of port where the government has effectively designed a specific tax arrangement and customs rules where they might not else kind of apply elsewhere. So they're place-based and the established rules of tax elsewhere effectively don't apply here. And this is done under the guise of generating economic activity. What this means in practice is that the kind of administrative process of customs documentation is streamlined and companies in free ports can effectively defer taxes until goods are moved or dodge them entirely. If they bring in goods to store or manufacture prior to re-exporting them again without facing, for example, the full tariffs or following procedures that they would normally face where they're not a free port. Now, while the narrative on free ports has really been ramped up in the recent kind of year and a half in the aftermath of Brexit, they're actually not new, nor are they banned in the EU. Many EU countries use them, and free ports have existed for hundreds of years. So at UK level, they were used in the 1980s, for example, in places like Birmingham, Cardiff, Liverpool and Prestwick. And just now in the EU, 21 member states still have free ports. So what exactly has the UK government proposed? Well, the Conservative Party manifesto included the creation of a kind of raft of free ports across the UK with the kind of primary aim to boost trade, jobs, investments with a view of innovating what they kind of deemed as business clusters. And it was really sold as a way to primarily benefit local areas and level up the economy across the UK with a kind of focus in terms of their narrative around this on rebalancing the north-south divide. And what they've more recently said is that free ports are on track to be open by the end of 2021. So this is quite a rapid process. Now, what's driving the kind of initiative behind free ports and the really kind of initiative to rally behind them? Well, the economic shock of Brexit now, particularly if we're going to see a no-deal Brexit, is likely to trigger really broader restructuring of our economy, and that's going to have massive implications in terms of the direction of travel of economic policy. And as I see it just now, the UK government has two options. The first is to harness, and this is no small task and will take an immense level of political will, to actively bolster the UK's trade and investment policy, and Katie will go on to speak in more detail about this in a few moments. What that would need to be do is kind of rooted in a green industrial strategy, for example, that would scale clean investment and exports, that would elevate that would be elevated by, for example, institutions or an ecosystem of institutions like a green investment bank. Or, and this is increasingly more likely, Brexit is likely to be capitalised on as a way to trigger a really seismic race to the bottom and mass deregulation. And under that scenario, what we're likely to see is a real doubling down on some of the worst aspects of status quo and the conventional wisdom surrounding our economy and how it has been, in my eyes, grossly mismanaged for several decades now. What we're likely to see off the back of that is increased inequality and a real failure to tackle climate collapse. And free ports, as I see it, fall into this category, that option. And we're already seeing warning signs of that approach. One of the first things that was done in the aftermath of the Brexit vote was to slash corporation tax. This is an unsustainable and economically debunked tax giveaway that will overwhelmingly benefit rich people in an effort to, boost the economy more broadly. Of course, that's never going to transpire. That hasn't transpired, as we've seen with all of the other tax giveaways for the rich. Well, what's being promised specifically for Freeports? Well, it's a package of tax reliefs to under the guise of driving jobs, of growth, innovation, attracting international investment, and boosting trade. And much of that, as I mentioned, has been sold as a way to level up. But the national and regional imbalances that we see throughout the UK exist through decades of investment gaps, of waves of deindustrialisation. And they sit in a broader, unequal, imbalanced economy and an economic structure that does not work for working class households and areas. So the question really then is, will Freeports turn that around? And the short answer there is no. So some have estimated that Freeports could create 150,000 jobs in the UK and bring incredible benefits. Well, it sounds good, but it's not really that straightforward. The UK Trade Policy Observatory warned that Freeports could simply divert economic activity from elsewhere, that there would actually be very limited economic benefits to Freeports, and the proportion of genuinely additional jobs and economic activity would be much, much lower than that. But if you're on the right, Freeports make sense because they are attractive. They are effectively a mechanism by which you can bypass regulation and bypass tax. But the benefits for the rest of the economy, to me, don't add up. There is a central pillar to Freeports, and it's come under heavy critique, and rightly so, that they are incredibly bad for tax justice. So. And I think part of this for me is about kind of contextualizing Freeports for what they are and what they are not, because when there's articles about them, when they're spoken about, there's often pictures accompanied by kind of bustling, active ports. And in reality, and Tax Justice Network have been brilliant at highlighting this, Freeports are often just large warehouses. They're effectively storage units. And I think that's important as part of this when we're thinking about kind of levelling up, revitalizing economies that have been so-called kind of left behind. That actually these are kind of massive warehouses. They're storage units. And they also risk a loss of tax revenue through tax breaks. And we need to ask ourselves who's really set to benefit from those tax breaks. And as Tax Justice Network has said, it would be really more accurate to refer to Freeports as free self-storage units for the ultra-rich. And that is definitely how I see this. There's also an issue, and it's ongoing actually. At the start of this year, the EU's executive branch have been asked to review this, of the links with criminal activity and Freeports. Some Freeports in the EU have been used for corruption, for tax evasion, and for criminal organisations that are effectively looking to bypass oversight. And to me, that gets to the heart of why regulation, why oversight is absolutely necessary. I stumbled across this quote from an economist, Quinn Slobodian, who summed up really nicely for me. I think I've just butchered his surname. I'm really sorry, Quinn. Who summed up really nicely for me, get to the heart of kind of what Freeports are and are not. And he said, far from bringing tangible economic benefits, the more likely outcome of UK Freeports is shifting existing jobs into enclaves around the country. As companies chase the tax breaks on offer. This is perhaps the most plausible way to understand the Freeport strategy. Rather than levelling up the UK as a tool of economic policy, the real agenda may be to deepen an ethos of market competition, entrench the power of corporations, and reinvent Thatcherism, Johnson style, for the 2020s. So in short, if we are actually looking to level up, if we're looking to create jobs, if we're looking to balance the North-South divide, and if we're looking to stimulate long-term meaningful investment, and if we're looking to boost trade, Freeports are not the answer. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was a really, really good overview. I'm now going to pass on to Stuart, and he can give us a bit of the perspective from the local trade union movement.
Thanks, Connor. As Connor said, my name's Stuart Fairweather and I'm the chair of Dundee Trades Union Council. I'm a member of Unite, and I might mention a bit more about that as I speak. And I guess I'm a kind of phony. This will probably be the first of many apologies in my short contribution, because I'm not the right kind of trade unionist, maybe to talk about the docks in Dundee or to talk about Freeports. I'm a local government worker, and I've spent today trying to sort out deals for community safety wardens, and trying to make sure social workers are reinstated, and try to look at childcare workers getting their full pay because of issues to do with shielding. And I think when Dundee thinks about its application for Freeports in this competition that's been unleashed by Rishi Sunak, it will use some of the iconography of the past. It will talk about the docks and its history. And there's loads of bits there to do with masculinity, to do with certain kinds of work, and to do with space and location, probably to do with empire as well. All those might get employed. And in the specific case of Dundee, the bid is likely to include the Michelin Innovation Park. So Miriam helps us out. Freeports will have rules, but already those that are making applications or want to break the rules or stretch the rules. And there's an alliance between Freeports in Dundee's case and the chief executive of Michelin Innovation Park. And Greg Cool, the chief exec of Michelin Innovation Park, tells us that the companies that they might attract there are already wide-eyed with the prospect of advantage. And what that means is, yes, taking advantage of the tax breaks that are inherently implied in terms of Freeports that Miriam's told us about, but it's also about taking advantage of workers in Dundee and workers in the wider region. One way to describe Freeports might be to describe them as a location for extraction, super extraction. So it's about coming to a city of 150,000, where 40,000 are in poverty, using the Scottish Government's statistics, and adding potentially to that situation by drawing employment to one area, but employment that would be unlikely to pay the living wage or draw on the skills and education Dundonians across the city and people across the region. The comment that was made about illicit activity shouldn't be lost. I don't want to be too glib, but bringing potentially lots of chemicals into Scotland's city that has the biggest issue with drug problems isn't necessarily the cleverest thing. And when I was alluding to the history of the docks, folk will tell you about Dundee docks, and everything went over the wall. You could get anything in any of the pubs in Dundee that went through Dundee city docks. So the permeability of what goes on at the docks is something that folk would want to acknowledge. But I think we need to consider what trade unions will say. The Trades Council, the organisation that brings together the trades unions in the city, primarily the public sector trade unions, that needs to be said, has a policy of calling for nationalisation of the ports, and that would include Dundee. Part of the motivation for that, however difficult, is to try and stop there being a monopoly or a cross-fertilisation of advantage. So Freeports, the name might give you a clue. Freeports own ports in Leith, in Dundee, in Grangemouth, in Rosyth, and at Tilbury Dock in London. And it isn't beyond the capacity of this competition for Freeports that they could bid for more than one and be successful for more than one. And the relationship between Dundee and the other ports would be something we would question. The race to the bottom that was alluded to would need to be looked at because we would want to talk about the environmental standards and the trade union rights at least being as good in Dundee as any of the other ports that bid across the country. So there's a history of Dundee Docks. There's a history of Michelin. The trade unions at Michelin were involved in the discussion about the new innovation park. I think I'm not being too provocative to say, was Unite invited in to put a wee bit gloss on the situation? Were they there for tokenism? That needs to be asked. Trades Council brings together trade unions from across the city. I would want to ask what the attitude of Unite and the GMB, maybe other unions, would be at the Scottish and UK level. I think there's a danger that they would chase jobs. I think there's a danger that they would be seduced by the language of work at the docks and the history, and would need to be very mindful of that. So we need to construct an alternative. At the STUC, the online STUC, last week, one of the key phrases was "bad jobs kill," and it was deployed importantly to do with health and safety, but because bad jobs do kill ultimately, and bad jobs kill the environment, and bad jobs kill communities, and we need to use that language rather than the language of chasing any job at any price anywhere. But that means building alliances. And I think in Dundee, we've made a start. I think the trade unions have worked as individuals with Dundee People's Assembly. It's said that we need to look at the economy as a subsection of a society, and society is a subsection of nature. So we want a quality ecosystem for our city, and in terms of employment and the economy. We want a positive ecosystem for our city in terms of the river and the region, and we want a positive ecosystem in terms of economy, in terms of work, and a different look at work, paid and unpaid, and what relationship we should have with that in the future. So there will be a debate and a discussion amongst trade unions. When we knocked the doors in 2014, people did talk about Dundee and jobs. They did talk about independence and the requirement for work. But there was space to talk about what kind of work, what kind of future, and what kind of alternative that we want to share with people. So I don't think we can waste any time. There's been an alliance built between the chief exec at Michelin Innovation Park, the chief exec and others at Freeports, who already have bank accounts, offshore bank accounts to deposit the money in, and an alliance, a tentative alliance with the City Council, who nodded in the direction of the bid, perhaps unsurprisingly. And we need to construct an alternative alliance. I think we could do that by the trade unions working with campaigning groups in the city, certainly working with Friends of the Earth and with the People's Assembly, and investing more in research and thinking. Miriam and others are involved in community wealth building, involved in activity in Ayrshire. It links community-based activity with council-wide activity, with region-wide activity. In Dundee, trade unions and communities have had next to no input into the Tay Cities deal. Another component that we need to consider alongside Freeports. So there are models, whether we look at Ayrshire or Preston or Cleveland, we can look at what others have done, begin to build an alliance, begin to put an alternative, but we would need to go back out to the doors or the online doors and build a base for our alternative view of the say. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Stuart. That was really good. And I think you're right that this discussion, we definitely have to bring it into the trade unions, and hopefully we might hear from some other trade unionists in the audience today. Just to introduce our third speaker, Katie, on you go.
Thanks, Connor. And I'm also here in a personal capacity this evening. I should give the caveat, the disclaimer, that I only sort of knew I was going to be joining about an hour and a half ago, so I'm not quite as prepared as I'd like to be, but I'll give it a bash. So I suppose I'd like to talk about how this relates to our future trade policy. You know, this is obviously connected to the Conservatives trying to make a success of Brexit. And we know that the main reasons for Brexit were twofold. One, the sort of xenophobic migrant conversation, but two, a pursuit of unfettered trade deals with bigger partners. And independent trade policy was seen as one of the big prizes. And so I think it's really important that we look at what's on the horizon in terms of our future trade policy. You know, the noises that we're hearing are that, you know, we want trade deals with economies 7 times our size, like the US, and we want to attract investment. And sadly, the public debate is sort of strained between these neoliberal goalposts. We're talking about, you know, will the Conservatives get this trade deal with the US, but we're not asking, will that benefit workers? What will that do to our environmental regulations? We're talking about, you know, will they attract enough investment? But we're not saying what stipulations will be put on that investment, for example, to make jobs, to sort of stay within the country for enough time to sort of have a rooted effect on communities. And, you know, Freeports are a really good example, as other speakers have said, of this approach. You know, this logic of driving down regulations, driving down tax in order to attract investment, in order to attract the private sector. But the evidence shows that this won't be delivered. You know, the analysis shows that probably the biggest change is that our imports will be cheaper into these free ports. So, I mean, that doesn't sound like it's going to be good. Flooding free ports with cheap imports that might compete with, you know, domestic business. So I think that, you know, we really need to, you know, analyse these false promises and the power that we hand over to investors who make big promises on jobs without having any stipulations on what they're going to actually deliver. It's given up sovereignty for unfettered foreign direct investment without, you know, thinking about what operations will happen in these regulatory black holes. We know from looking at, you know, Freeports is one example, but there's also there's EPZs, there are SEZs, special economic zones, these sort of economic areas that regulations and workers' rights and environmental protections and tax breaks are all given to say, hey, come and do your business here because it's better than just across the border. And, you know, you have people who are living in dormitories with very little rights, not being paid a good wage, and sort of being stuck in these supply chains that aren't good for the environment and aren't good for the people who are working in them. You know, and there's a few myths that need to be busted, you know, because, you know, we do probably need to attract investment, but to benefit who and with what expectations? We probably do want to think about our boosting trade, but not all trade is created equal. Do we want to be trading in, you know, high carbon emitting, low workers' rights supply chains, or do we want to generate an industrial policy that can take us on a high road towards, you know, a better, more green future? And we do need to create jobs, but it's a straw man to say, you know, we can create jobs this way and that's the only way. That this idea that a job is better than no job, that's just not the case, and we need to be creating progressive visions that can push against this dogma. And I suppose that's why, you know, there's been 40 years of outsourced trade policy means that we're sort of underprepared for the moment that's coming towards us, and I think that we really need to get our house in order to be able to be, because this is really just the start of it, and there's going to be more waves of this in the coming years as Brexit unfolds, unless something really massive happens. But, you know, there's a series of things that we should be beginning to promote. For example, rooting our future trade policy in a robust industrial policy that can deliver both in our climate and social justice ambitions. You know, the idea of industrial policy has been, you know, considered, you know, backward for the last few decades, but lo and behold, governments are beginning to speak about it right now. People like Biden are beginning to talk about industrial policy, and that's the exact sort of thing that needs to be designed before we enter into trade agreements and before we begin to think about trade. Anything else is like trying to build a house without having a blueprint for it. If we don't have a vision for how we're going to achieve full employment and achieve our climate ambitions, then there's no point in entering into these massive trade agreements. The second thing is that our trade policy needs to be subordinate to our other ambitions. You know, this idea that all trade and investment is fundamentally good, you know, like Stuart and Miriam were saying, you know, we have to get into the detail of the quality of the trade and investment. And that means that, you know, we can't be saying, you know, we wish we could do these nice things, but sadly, you know, we have to prioritize trade. The third thing is that we need to make sure our public services are off the table, you know, and this is a huge risk. And we need to take steps too to renationalise some of the things that have been taken out of public hands. You know, and this goes into this really, you know, in all of these different areas is really about policy space, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, if we can't protect our public services in the next few years from trade agreements, the writing on the wall is that they will continue to be privatised and will continue to lose sovereignty to private investors who are not really interested in the quality of the jobs or the sort of the climate impacts that they'll be having. We've already seen that with the way that, you know, our care sector has went, and with the way that, you know, for example, England and Wales are the only countries in the world that have a completely privatised water system. And those private companies have polluted beaches in England and Wales 3,000 times this year. You know, that's just not on. Number 4 is that we need to find ways to build people power over corporate power. At the moment, there are too many things in trade and investment policies that prioritise the interests of corporates. There are too many binding mechanisms that mean that they can sue governments, but we can't, you know, hold them to account for their violations. And that we need to sort of enter into that debate and have sort of push our representatives to be thinking about how we're going to, you know, steer the waters in an independent trading entity outside of the EU. And then lastly, you know, the global justice element, we shouldn't be pursuing unfettered trade and investment agreements just to undermine the interests of people in other places in the world. You know, and a lot of these different things come down to policy space. You know, we have a trade and investment architecture which constrains like national government's ability to do all the things and to pull all the levers that they might want to pull. You know, things that are fundamental to an industrial policy like subsidies are just not legal in WTO rules. You know, and we've seen this recently where, you know, I don't know the full ins and outs of the BIFAB case, but, you know, people have been talking about state aid as a member of the EU, but you'd also be facing the restrictions on policy space as a WTO member. And thinking about, you know, that's a prime example of where a foreign investor has come into Scotland to try and create jobs, and then held to ransom the jobs and the government. And that's just that shouldn't be the power balance that sort of tips our industrial future and the future of working households across the country. So I mean, my perspective is that there's 3 like immediate things that we need to be thinking about. The first one is that we need to have a progressive response for this bigger picture that the Dundee port is an example of. This is just the start. There's going to be ongoing sort of diminishing of our policy space and the interests of expanding trade and investment as Brexit unfolds. The second thing is that we really need to be pushing for a public expansionary approach to creating jobs. You know, for example, the opportunity of the Scottish National Investment Bank, you know, instead of this sort of, you know, like how will we make sure that we attract foreign investors, like thinking about how we can create jobs and have a core component of national ownership and national industrial policy. And then lastly, in this thing about policy space, we need to be creating both finding the loopholes now that of the flexibilities that we can have to begin to do stuff but also be thinking bigger about how we alter this architecture in the long run to make sure we have policy space. And, you know, as far as independence goes, you know, that's always been one of the key sort of things, is that we will run up to the limitation of our fiscal and monetary levers if we want to do a lot of this stuff. And so thinking about, you know, considering these ambitious visions that we might have, but that we might not know what they look like, but how possible are they really if we are constrained by rules that don't serve people but serve corporates? So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really informative. And also thank you for coming onto the panel at such short notice. I really appreciate that. We're going to move now to like a general kind of question and discussion part of the meeting. So I'd like to invite anyone who maybe has any thoughts or any questions they'd like to put to our panel to come in. And I see a hand up from Emily.
Yeah, thanks. So I think trade policy kind of has the reputation of being impenetrable for people who don't have lots and lots and lots of degrees. And obviously this presentation today has shown that there are accessible ways of explaining these issues. I guess I'm wondering, what sort of strategies does the panel envision for how we can take forward sort of a resistance to Freeports in a way that, you know, doesn't alienate people, but also gets, you know, good levels of education and like intellectual engagement in it?
Who's keen to take on that one?
Could you quickly repeat that, Emily? Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, what sort of strategies are there for ways that we can kind of demystify trade politics or trade policy without sort of losing like the teeth of the issue, the meat of the issue?
I've got another question, so I can just bundle them together if you like. I've got a question from Alan.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. It's kind of opened my mind a bit because, and I think it was Kate that mentioned that what sort of regime are people going to come in under? And I kind of thought back to remember the days of the enterprise zones. You know, when they used to come into the city and got, you know, money, but at least the workers were protected by legislation of health and safety. Big concern of mine is really about the tax. That works well. Now, well, I ken that if they can dodge it, they'll dodge it. You know, I mean, that brings in a lot of money to the exchequer because there's not many bloody loopholes in the tax legislation that people can legally dodge tax. You know, and this could be another arm that I think we had a recent indication with Donald Trump's golf course up in Scotland. He got that course with the promise of hundreds of jobs, millions spent on building, and what did Scotland get out of it? Half a golf course, half a hotel, and the pleasure of Donald coming and playing. You know, so there's huge problems there. I'm not surprised the SNP in Dundee did this, because when I was a member of the SNP Trade Union Group, and I remember fighting against the right in the party about trade union rights and that, and they're soft Tories, a lot of the SNP. So it's going to go through without much of a political pushback from, because as somebody said, they sell it under jobs. Powerful argument. They're selling this under jobs. We're creating jobs. You can't attack that into the schemes and argue that, you know, this is not the right type of job. We need to firm that argument up. It's how the man in the street is going to react to you saying, we can't attack that because they're crap jobs. When a man's or a woman's desperate just to get work. You know, so we've got huge problems there, you know, and formulating an argument. I mean, I think we've got a chance, but you've got to think we'll be trying to dissuade the average man in the street, you know, and the soft Tory voter on a taxation question, because there might be a bit of leeway there with the soft Tory voter. So it's going to be a hard one. It's not going to be easy today, even with the trade unions on board. It's going to be a real difficult sell because you're desperate for work in Dundee, you know, like everybody else. you know, people grasp at hope, and it's a hard thing. And I don't want to win Indy and lose the win the war, but lose the battle because we're stuck with Freeports, you know. So there's huge connotations for the Indy movement, for the man in the street, for collecting taxes in a fair and equitable way. And, you know, I think we're behind the line on this. We need to pick up our game a wee bit, I think. Sorry, that was a rant.
No worries, Alan. We really appreciate people taking the time just to comment as well. This is a space for discussion as well as it is for questions. Marty.
Yeah, it's just to pick up on something that Katie said, which I thought was really good, that it's like, the question is, Freeports for who? Like, we're going to be losing our sovereignty to foreign direct investment. And I think a good example of this is, if we look in the aftermath of the Eurozone crisis, we can see that the Chinese state bought up a number of seaports all across the Mediterranean, most prominently Piraeus in Athens, which they aim to expand into the biggest port in Europe for the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think my question is, should we be concerned about another economic crisis like the Eurozone crisis that we saw, or even a pandemic, which could see a number of the enterprises involved in buying up ports just now, then selling them off to state bidders in the future for political manoeuvring?
A great question. I'm going to go back to the panel now and see if anyone wants to come in on any of those. Okay, on you go. Oh, Miriam.
Yeah, amazing questions. Firstly, yeah, I think just on the first question on demystifying trade, I've spent the last few days doing a trade report with Katie, had sort of yesterday both of us been like, yeah, our brains are absolute mush after that amount of acronyms, and I think that does actually really tap into some of these issues, because what we are speaking about are issues that really matter to folk. It's jobs, it's public services, it's investment in the economy, like it's our climate and environmental regulations, but it's often lost in a kind of malaise of endless abbreviations, and actually that's not accessible, and it's not good for kind of levels of political education of what the kind of, and I think part of that is coming down to the heart of it is, you know, actually tapping in to the way in which trade actually kind of shapes every aspect of our economy. It shapes its direction of travel, it shapes minimum wages of countries, it shapes, you know, ability to transition away from fossil fuels, it shapes environmental and climate protections, and it's so much bigger than it's often spoken about. It's often spoken about as this kind of simple transaction of goods and services, and that's just not a reality of what trade is. And could probably argue it's never been that. Sorry, there's a wee question here. Yeah, great. I thought it was to me then, 1 moment. So I think in terms of kind of demystifying it, it's about really bringing it down to how it actually impacts the kind of real economy, how that impacts households, how that impacts spending, how that impacts our ability to steer an industrial strategy, how that impacts public ownership, how it taps into all of these areas of the economy that actually matter to folk. And I think it's quite difficult to kind of envisage how you know, a trade deal with the US might send drug prices skyrocketing in the UK in 5 years' time. That's quite abstract, and I think that, you know, and I think it is sometimes quite difficult to convey exactly how that will happen. You know, the fact that the US has said we're seeking full market access. And we saw that with discussions around TTIP as well, which was kind of one of the biggest campaigns around kind of trade justice in terms of the opposition to it. And some of the responses for me were quite, you know, inadequate in so much as saying, well, it doesn't specifically say it's going to privatise all of the NHS. Well, it doesn't need to specifically say it's going to privatise all of the NHS. That's, you know, nobody would code that into, well, maybe some do. I would be very surprised if what coded that specifically into a trade deal. But what it might say is the likes of what the US has just said, which is that they would seek, you know, full market access. They would seek to liberalise. They would seek to, and there's a whole kind of language around this that does effectively mean kind of privatise. It does mean shrink in policy space. It does mean watering down of vital regulations or of labour rights and working conditions. Not just in the UK, of course, that's globally, and actually, you know, we've been a major aggressor in terms of the impact that our trade deals have had internationally on many others as well for a long time. On the kind of point around Freeports, and I think your point is absolutely brilliant, Alan, in saying, you know, a lot of people don't have jobs and they want jobs. So are they going to say, no, thanks, those jobs aren't good enough for us? And I think that really taps into the heart of the matter here. I think in terms of Freeports, it's about being very upfront in saying, not only are these not good jobs, it's also not the level of jobs we're being promised. And in terms of kind of exacerbating levels of inequality in society, we're also, you know, allowing the ultra rich and massive companies to dodge taxes and regulation in the process of not creating that many good jobs and not creating as good as jobs as we want. So there's kind of bigger picture aspect to that, but I think your point absolutely still resonates. Part of this for me is about saying, well, what are the alternatives to that then? If we know, and just now that's really important because we're heading into this, you know, deep and profound economic crisis. We're facing the possibility of mass unemployment, some of the projections of unemployment we haven't seen since the Thatcher years. That to me should be a moment of like real political awakening. And with this virus and with the pandemic, so much of what it's done is not only kind of create new vulnerabilities in the economy, it's also kind of shone a spotlight on fractures and inadequacies and imbalances and injustices in our economy that have existed for a very, very long time and that have been kind of created as such, as we've seen the power of labour diminish. And that to me should really trigger questions around kind of the role of government. What role should government play? Government's not powerless here. We're not just kind of sat around waiting for private investment to come in and save us all. Actually, like the government could take a more interventionist approach and actually say we're going to actively create jobs. You know, one of the things that we should do, as well as the areas in kind of direct relation to what Katie was speaking about in terms of kind of priorities for trade and investment, one of the things that we should do, certainly in the aftermath of this crisis and in the immediate aftermath of the kind of worst edge of the crisis in terms of the pandemic, is look to initiate the largest green stimulus package possible. We have historically low borrowing costs just now, so it is an absolutely brilliant time to invest. And what that can do is actively create good green jobs the length and breadth of the UK. Now that is a political choice, whether we do that or not. But the idea of simply saying, well, we can't reject Freeports because just now we don't have that many jobs and we're at a loss as to what to do, like that's not good enough. You know, actually we need that stimulus package there to invest, to create jobs. And we can do that if we look at kind of areas of the economy that would serve not only to lessen economic inequality, but also address the climate crisis just now and create jobs in the process of doing so. If we look at areas like a national retrofitting programme of homes, it can reduce fuel poverty, it reduces bills, it creates jobs, it tackles emissions. Like those are the sorts of initiatives that we should be seeing as part of that stimulus package to say, like, look, we can tick all of these boxes with a series of massive rollouts in our economy and decarbonise the economy in the process of doing so. So I think it's not, you know, and that taps into kind of what Katie was speaking about there in terms of us being kind of siloed into this box of being like thinking just solely in the space of like how we've been, you know, how the economy has been run and the kind of conventional wisdoms and assumptions that come alongside that, when in actual fact this crisis should exactly be the moment to start questioning a lot of the assumptions that have been embedded in the kind of status quo operation of our economy for a long time that have worked to the detriment of our climate and the detriment of working class communities and households in the UK.
Thanks, Miriam. Katie, do you want to come in?
Aye, sure. I think the question that Emily raised is totally important. You know, like if I get started, I could probably rhyme off about 100 acronyms that are all to do with trade that you're just, yeah, like it's nonsense. I totally agree with Miriam. You know, you need to get case studies that make it personal. You know, things like that were used by the trade movement in the UK, like chlorinated chicken and protecting the NHS. because these things make it personal. You don't want to be eating chicken that's like eating food that's not been in a good supply chain. You don't want to be, you know, seeing your NHS sold off. And I think that, you know, finding things that are local, that make it personal, that can speak to the interests, because like Miriam was saying, you know, this trade over the years has penetrated so many areas of domestic policy making. Even though it claims to be, you know, completely about deregulation, the reality is that it's been regulation in the interests of upholding corporate monopolies, and it penetrates so many areas of our domestic policy space. And so there's lots and lots of ways to make it personal. So I think that would be my suggestion. And it's not always straightforward, you know, like things like talking about government procurement isn't sexy, but when you start talking about bringing supply chains back and thinking about, you know, why is it that, you know, some multinational that's headquartered on the other side of the world is you know, printing things for for example, my dad lost his job in a printers because they lost all the NHS contracts for printing because it was cheaper to get things printed in another part of the world. And, you know, and that's not to say that we should be undermining, you know, jobs elsewhere in the world, but, you know, there are environmental and labour reasons to bring some supply chains back. There's a really good question in the chat, which is about green and eco-friendly trade policy without doing conservative economic protectionism. And I think that, you know, there's truth in that, but, you know, it is very possible to be eco-friendly and internationalist, for example, and there are a lot of myths around this. For example, food supply chains. Transport takes up a tiny, tiny proportion of the emissions of our food. I'll put something in the chat box of some research on this, which shows, but basically take any food type, and there are, you know, we're not going to be growing pineapples anytime soon, folks. So like things like keeping our trade open, duty-free and quota-free for southern countries who are poorer to be able to send their foods to us, that's definitely green and supports farmers in other parts of the world. And is internationalist, you know, and there are other things too. You know, the UK has the capacity, because of its fiscal and monetary sort of expansion possibilities that Miriam was laying out again about the low interest rates, has the possibility to mean that we could be, you know, this big green stimulus package to expand our green technologies or what have you. The thing is, intellectual property rights at the WTO prevent countries from being able to access certain technologies that protect them. You know, we could unilaterally decide to nationalize certain, you know, industries that are emerging green innovations and share those technologies with other countries. And that would be a way of, you know, supporting other countries to do their own green just transitions without having to deal with the costly intellectual property rights that would burden them from being able to transition out of fossil fuels. So there are lots of things that we could do with our trade and investment policy if we are ambitious enough and if we're, you know, internationalist and pro-worker. Alan, I totally agree on the tax dodging about this sort of the inevitability of people going to dodge, you know, and I think that there's obviously this conversation right now about how are we going to afford things, which is very much, you know, a red herring, because we can afford what we're doing right now. But there are, you know, there are some conversations emerging around a wealth tax or capital gains tax. But, you know, they're also starting to talk about taxing people who work from home and taxing people who earn just over 19,500, anything except actually tackling the billionaires, you know. So like, I think that we really do need to have a conversation about reforming our tax system. And you know, Miriam also mentioned about green fiscal stimulus to create investment, but we need to bust some myths about attracting investment too. Lowering taxes and lowering rates isn't the only way to attract investment. A crucial fundamental part of an industrial policy would be education and training for people, having folk who are able to work in a range of different upgraded sectors. That's another way that you attract investment. So it's not that all foreign investment is bad, it's just that the quality needs to be there and we need to be attracting them for the right reasons. And I'll stop there.
That's great, thanks Katie. And also I just want to say, because people are mentioning this idea of demystifying trade, I'm just reminded back in 2016 I sent a very long press release to the Courier about TTIP. And the only thing that they took out and made a headline was Arbroath Smokies could lose protected name status internationally. I thought it was such a weird thing to bring out of that. But it's a great example of making it local. Stuart, do you want to come in and maybe explain a little bit, particularly in respect of what Dundee People's Assembly has been doing in terms of environmental campaigning and environmental investment?
Well, yeah, it points in the direction of what could happen. So Dundee People's Assembly brought people together using this type of technology to discuss the impact of the climate emergency on the city. And its focus was carbon related, as you might expect. But to answer Emily's question, I suppose, we need to talk about what the economy is for. And it seems really odd because we don't, we've heard talk of the real economy, and we need to talk about the relationship between economy and need. So the People's Assemblies, the plan is to have them across the city. There's been a bit of internal debate. I don't think I'm letting away any secrets about whether the focus should just be on climate, with the suggestion that stuff about carbon and climate's at one end of the spectrum and social issues are at another end of the spectrum. And folk are saying that's not the issue. We want to talk about real economy and we want to talk about trade. We need to talk about, are we going to build low carbon emitting buses at Michelin? Are we, is the space that's the Freeport at the moment going to contribute to Dundee's economy rather than extract from it? We need to ask about rent, actually. We need to ask about why is there so much money flowing out of Dundee's poorest communities? Because if we're looking for investment, we've got the money. It's just going in the wrong direction. So we should do that. I just wanted to, we should have more discussion, but one more thing, Connor. Dundee has a fair trade city. You know, if you go to the outskirts, there's these bonny signs saying Dundee's a fair trade city. It'd be awfully strange if the exception was a big hole in the middle of the city that was the port, where it wasn't a free trade, where the policy space exists, but exists in such an opaque way that's not about us. Our job is to talk about the real economy, talk about need in Dundee, and transfer the economy to addressing that need, no addressing the need of the billionaires that were mentioned.
Thanks, Stuart. And just to remind people, if you've got questions and you don't want to come on audio, feel free to put them in the chat. I will put them to our speakers. But I've got a question from Alan Graham.
Hi, cheers. Really enjoyed it so far. It's good to have a bunch of experts talking about issues that are totally alien to me and don't know much about. A couple of things have came up during the discussion and things to ask about. Something that stands out is so far we've had, what, close to £1 billion sunk, or that's the plan of what's being sunk into the Riverside. You know, how much of that's actually going to reach it to people in Dundee? What's their economic plan? Are they planning to spend, say, 100 million on the docks in a low tax area? When do they expect to raise £100 million in tax to cover the cost of what's been being spent to build this Freeport? I've not heard any actual plans of this. Something that kind of Stuart touched on about the impact on communities and the, you know, drugs in Dundee and the smuggling from the ports and stuff. I mean, if we're talking about higher crime and smuggling, you're talking about organised crime, probably greater drugs being brought in, being more dangerous groups spreading them. Potentially, you know, if with more activity at the port, I would expect there's going to be more exploitation and sex work and so on in the area. Don't know whether that's true or not, but that would be my gut feel. You know, there's those kind of negative effects on the area too, right? And something that struck me was about the environmental impact. You know, if we're talking about way more ships coming into the river, you know, way more pollution into the area. But there's a couple of things I've been reading recently. One's about in Italy, in one of the ports, there was a bunch of crates that came in that were marked as being recyclable metal or metal to be scrap or whatever. And when they scanned them later, they've discovered there was like radioactive metals from medical equipment that was in the middle of this, and it was, had a massive expense to move it somewhere and deal with it. And if you're talking about lower regulation and less checks, who knows what's going to be coming into the port. And then there's things like in Lebanon, where there was the explosion at the port, where there was a whole bunch of stuff stored in the warehouses, where the ships and the companies had went bust, and it was trying to find out who owned it and getting it out of there. And they knew it was dangerous, but they couldn't get rid of it, sort of thing. So there's all these kind of things in the longer term. It's not just about, we're going to make 300 jobs and 200 people are going to be employed building warehouses or whatever. There's these longer term things as well. Just wondered if there's any info you can give about that.
Sure. Does anyone want to come in on that just now?
I can quickly come in on just the, Katie, were you going to come in? You go first. I went first last time. No, all right. Yeah, just on the kind of tax cuts, I know it sounds basic to say, but like so much of that is predicated on a trickle down mantra of that this will kind of reach the benefits of communities, it will reach the benefits of working class people. And actually, like what we see is the opposite of that. And we see that in company structures, we see that across the economy as well. What we tend to see, if we take the company as an example of this kind of shoring up of wealth within the company, we see kind of, bloated CEO salaries, like excess kind of payouts and to dividends and share buybacks and shareholders. And actually, what we don't see is the investment in the kind of real productive capacity of the economy, of the company. We don't see meaningful investment in workers' salaries if we take something like Amazon again. And I think that is actually a good example in Scotland, because that, and Alan, you're right to raise the case there of Donald Trump's golf course, because these all have these are all interconnected, right? Because this was kind of promising jobs. And as you said, kind of facing waves of deindustrialization and really kind of profound imbalances in terms of kind of where those jobs are and what type of jobs they are, does feel sometimes like it leaves folk in the predicament of being like, well, if they're promising jobs, then that's good. But actually then going back to kind of the way in which wealth shores up, what do we see in the likes of Amazon warehouses? Do we see investment in the productive capacity of those of that company? Do we see investment in salaries? Do we see proper labour rights for folk? No, what we've seen is kind of exploitation. We've seen incredibly low wage, precarious jobs that were created off the back of that. And for me, that's indicative of kind of broader kind of attitudes to corporate tax cuts as well. Well, it'll incentivize investment, and ultimately that's a good thing, and the benefits will trickle down. But actually what we see is that they are lost in so many ways. They're lost in the shoring up of wealth, but they're also lost in terms of their impact on the tax base as well. And there's an example here. So there was a tax cut that was actually reversed, but was a planned tax cut from corporate tax cut, and that's the main corporate tax rate, from 19% to 17%. Now that tax cut alone was estimated to cost the taxpayer £6 billion. And for me, that really gets to the heart of this, is that, we've tried this. Like we've tried this for a really long time. And we've tried kind of hacking away at regulation. We've tried slashing corporation tax in the hope that in the hope that it will somehow trickle down and rebalance our economy. It will stimulate jobs and growth and prosperity for all. But actually what we're seeing is an abject failure there to actually kind of manifest any of the promises that it brings. And we actually see kind of, on the flip side, hugely detrimental outcomes of that as well. I just want to quickly go over kind of a couple of other areas. And it was one point that Katie made there about the like need to kind of incentivize investment, and that actually being a really good thing so long as it's good investment. I think we can't shy away from that. And if we look at kind of what's necessary for investment, and Katie touched upon like training and skills, absolutely. Like what we also need is like strong research and development. That when people are looking at kind of like where they want to invest and why, like strong R&D, it's about an educated workforce, but a healthy workforce as well. and good infrastructure, and that comes in all shapes and forms. That's not just your physical infrastructures, that's your social infrastructures as well. All of that creates a good environment for investment. And like I would prefer to have folk investing because of all of those areas, rather than saying, all right, well, we might get away with paying people a bit less here, and we can kind of dodge kind of labour rights, and we can dodge taxes to come here. Actually, you know, that's not the reality of the investment landscape. And who are we going to attract investment from if that is our priority? And I think that we'll see more of the Donald Trumps. I think we'll see more Amazons. I think we'll see more Freeports under that strategy. And actually the kind of meaningful long-term investment that can actively create jobs, that can incentivize, you know, green investment, for example, with a strategy that is focused in training, it is focused in job creation, it is good job creation, I should say, it is focused in R&D, it is focused in a healthy and more equal labour force as well. And lastly, I just want to touch upon the point that was raised earlier in terms of a kind of climate-friendly approach to trade. Just now, we're facing this kind of compounding crisis of trade at multiple levels. So we've got the kind of crisis of multilateralism just now, and when we're seeing that manifest in many ways, we're seeing decades of discontent with people who've been kind of left at the sharp end of trade imbalances. But we're also seeing this kind of rise of protectionism from far-right figures like Trump, who are actually kind of co-opting some of the language around discontent of trade. And that, you know, and we're also seeing kind of governance gridlocks at the WTO. We're also seeing situations like Brexit manifest as well. And in that moment, I think it's especially important to have conversations like this about how we have a thriving, healthy, strong, green and fair trading future. Because frankly, like, we can't retreat just now. Like retreating just now is not an option. And also just saying, well, we don't really like the way that this is just now, that's also not an option, because we actually need to be putting forward practical alternatives to the current trading system that isn't working for a lot of folk. And I think that's why conversations like this really matter just now, because it's actually seeking out the type of alternatives that we want. You know, how can we incentivize good investment? How can we create good jobs through trade? How can we protect our public services and the public services elsewhere through trade deals as well? How can we rein in corporate power to ensure that communities actually benefit from this, and that climate and environmental protections are actually adhered to and scaled massively, because they need to be very quickly. And yeah, so I think that's why conversations like this are exactly necessary, because simply saying, no, we don't like it, that's not good enough just now, because there's actually a window of opportunity where the trading system's effectively on its knees, and something better can emerge out of that, but it won't unless we try.
Thanks very much, Miriam. Do any other panel members want to come in? Stuart, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, there was just a few things. I thought Alan and Graham probably summarised the negative aspects of Freeports really well. And we do need to capture that and have the argument. We do need to build alliances to get away from shiny inward investment that comes at a high price. And Marty's earlier point about competitors, there's already competitors looking at fourth ports. So there's the devil you know, but there's also the devil that you don't know, if that's the right phraseology. Just on Alan's points, there's been no discussion with the neighbours. There's been no discussion with the people in Stobswell about a free port. There's been no discussion with the now not insignificant population that live in the docks area. When Baldovi incinerator was moving ownership, we worked with Friends of the Earth in the past to have a good neighbour agreement. Would a free port have a good neighbour agreement? What would it say to the people on its edge? Would it welcome inspection by environmental health, by the police, by regulators, or would it be a shady area? Already on the edge of the port, is aspects of commercial sexual exploitation that Alan alluded to. It's something that might grow. The talk about organised crime isn't insignificant when we're talking about unregulated free ports, and Dundee were alive to the concerns about that. So we do need an alternative. I am not a fan of the investment that's gone into the V&A and the City Quay and the waterfront, but it does seem odd to have a tourist attraction next to an unregulated free port. It does seem odd to have a tourist attraction next to an unregulated free port on the best estuary in Europe. What we should be talking about is why people can't travel from Montrose to Perth along the coast. What we should be talking about is how we make energy out of the Tay. What we should be talking about is if there's going to be offshore wind and renewables, why they're not being made in Dundee, and we're taking advantage of Dundee and Angus College, Abertay University and Dundee University. We need a different vision. And one of the things I think we should say, given this has been recorded, is Dundee's too small a city. Dundee's hemmed in, and we should be talking about Dundee and its relationship to the region. We should be talking about its relationship to Angus, to the near parts of Perth and Kinross, and to the near parts of Fife. And that sort of notion, energy and ambition, speaks to trade, inward trade as well as outward trade, and it talks about a different transformed economy, and that's what we should be talking for Scotland's future. No the grubby, opaque, tax dodging, I could say all the other words. We need something that's positive, forward looking, that's about different relations between women and men, different relations with the economy, different relations with the environment. That's what our city should be about, and the docks area should be central to that.
Thanks, Stuart. Katie, do you want to come in before I go back to questions?
Sure. I don't know how I can follow that. I just loved everything you said, Stuart. That was amazing, Stuart, for First Minister. I suppose I don't have a huge amount to add. I think that Stuart and Miri have covered loads of stuff. I suppose there's like one thing is just, to emphasize that the way we've done things has failed, right? This free trade expansionism has not worked. Here it's created precarious jobs and sluggish growth and rampant inequality. In the poorest countries, there's been pretty much zero development. They talk about how many 100 million people have been brought out of poverty. Those people were in China, and that was because of China's approach to industrial policy. I'm not saying that is the way to go, but you can't use free trade as the reason that we have slightly decreased the amount of poverty in the world. And I think that what Miri is alluding to about like equality is fundamentally about the way we measure trade. We need to stop talking about export deficits and the amount of investment we've attracted and start talking about the labour market share of GDP. How much of GDP is going into people's wages? We need to start talking about how many jobs did that foreign investment create? And those are the, how many tons of emissions did that investment allow us to decrease? We need to find better indicators that can be more aligned to the sort of the future that Stuart's talking about for Dundee, that can speak to people personally, and reframe the reason we do trade in the first place, which is supposed to be so that we can all thrive. And then I think, I think it was Alan who was saying about the issues of pollution. And, I think Stuart's totally right when he was saying about, the nostalgia of the port. I come from Coatbridge, which is a mining and a steel town. And, you'd think that it was the glory days working down the mines, and we know it wasn't necessarily. So there's this sort of like nostalgia of old industry because it seemed to offer a security that people don't have right now. And I suppose that is where this vision comes in, this sort of a different imagined port for Dundee, a different imagined way that Scotland trades, different imagined way that we are part of a global trading system that doesn't try and undermine each other, but actually works in cooperation. And I suppose like that, that is imagination is the best way to tackle this sort of more backward-looking nostalgia. That might, for example, Ravenscraig and the pollution there, that really impacted people's families. There's always a dirty side to these high polluting industries that we can point out and say we can do better. It's okay to have respect for the past, but we want something better. Yeah, and there was something else about. And yeah, that just sort of to go to Chrissy's comment in the comment box. No, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think that goes back to sort of offering something different, having it costed, having sort of examples of the direct impact on people's lives. That's how you win the argument.
Thanks, Katie. Before I bring in Marty, I just wanted to put a question in myself, actually, which is, Katie, that you mentioned in your introduction the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I know that launched officially on Monday with its first investment, and I'm curious to know what you think about the bank itself and whether it's ambitious enough. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious to hear an inside view. But before I bring in, I'll let Marty ask his question.
Thanks for that. It's not really a question. It's just something that I wanted to raise. Like Stuart made the point that nobody in Stobie's been consulted on this. I live right behind where the rigs currently are on the Tay, and I'm thinking back to something that I saw a couple of months ago, which was, I think most people would have seen it online, which was that massive explosion in Lebanon at the port. And when we're talking about Freeports and what's coming into the city, we don't know the kind of chemicals and things that are going to be stored down there. And I really don't fancy being blown to pieces by illegal chemicals coming and being stored in a warehouse just at the back of me. I think over 200 people died and decimated the entire front port in Beirut in Lebanon. And I remember reading it left something like over 200,000 people homeless because it just destroyed houses in the community. And I think that's something that really needs to be thought about. Like Stuart made good points on consultation of people in the community, and we need to know what's going to be happening down there if it does go ahead, which I hope it doesn't, by the way.
Thanks very much, Marty. Just to go back to the panel, and I think we said originally this event would end at 8:30, so I think we're going to probably wrap up pretty shortly unless anyone has a final question. So does the panel want to come in on any of the specific points, and then we'll give everyone the opportunity to wrap up?
There was a comment in the comments box about bad jobs kill, and Marty's point, Alan made it earlier similarly, about what chemicals are coming in or what's coming in. It just occurs to me that other trade unionists in the Fire Brigade Union, somebody mentioned SEPA, in the health service, did they get a say on this? Because who's going to be cleaning up the mess? The ongoing mess or any dramatic mess? And it'll be interesting to see who gets a vote. Is it trade unionists in the perceived industries of the past, or is it trade unionists in the caring sector and in the service sector? So that gives me a wee help when I'm going to look for allies and going to look for constructing an argument about the Freeport.
Thanks, Stuart. Anyone else want to come in just now?
I can come in on the Scottish National Investment Bank if that's useful.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think overall Scottish National Investment Bank is a massive achievement. I think that for several reasons. Like the first is that it is a recognition of a kind of transition, what I hope will be a transition away from the state simply responding to market failures. And we see that through kind of the measures, and we've seen that a lot in the pandemic, kind of but kind of prior to that, in the state's role in terms of kind of stepping in to nationalise specific areas, specific industries that have faced market failure. And what I hope Scottish National Investment Bank will do is actually kind of recognise that we can be involved in actually kind of steering and shaping the future of our economy, and actually kind of rather than just responding to the failure of the market and take a much more kind of interventionist approach. And that'll bring kind of benefits with it as well, a longer term strategy. And I hope, and I know it's been mentioned a lot in this call, I hope kind of ramping up a discussion about the future of an industrial strategy, kind of what kind of economy do we want to live in? How do we plan for that? How do we ensure that we have the right levels of investment in the right sectors? And also kind of steer a different direction of travel for the kind of nature of companies as well. Like Stuart mentioned, the community wealth building. You know, what could something like a Scottish National Investment Bank, because I think it's very versatile in terms of its potential, right? What could it do to help facilitate community wealth building that actually, you know, serves people, that serves communities, that sees a transfer of physical and financial assets to the hands of communities, and is rooted in pillars of kind of everything from labour rights to fair procurement, to really kind of transform from the bottom up. But you could have institutions like a National Investment Bank that could be kind of steered to actively kind of incentivise that. And I think it's particularly important in Scotland because we saw the sale of the Green Investment Bank. Now, to me, the Green Investment Bank was one of the most significant kind of policy directives of an otherwise quite bleak policy landscape from Westminster. And it was based in Edinburgh, and it was meant to kind of incentivize green investment. It was meant to scale it. It was meant to help with exports. It created jobs. For me, that was a really good step in the right direction. And then what we saw, I think it was in 2016, was the sale of that to a company called Macquarie, which has investments in oil, gas, and coal, and a reputation for asset stripping as well. And what we've seen off the back of that is, you know, a really kind of failure to adhere to the green principles of the Green Investment Bank, and a kind of lack of security in terms of its investments going forward as well. That to me is quite emblematic of the two different kind of market-led approaches, or a kind of approach that actually, you know, steers and guides a different approach going forward. And I think that is why the Scottish National Investment Bank is so significant, is because it is mission-led in its statement. It is about reaching net zero. It is about kind of climate targets. I think there's a need to ensure that the governance structure reflects that. And I wrote a report with a Scottish economist called Laurie McFarlane a little while ago, and we touched upon this too in the report. And one of the things that we advocated was the creation of something that would be kind of mission boards as part of the bank, to ensure that the views of kind of trade unionists, of environmental groups, of civil society organisations, perhaps of local authority representatives as well, aren't kind of subordinate to the kind of everyday operation of the board, and we see a much more kind of collaborative approach. And I think that can be true elsewhere as well. We need to ensure that they're kind of investing in in-house capacity to maximise the outcome of the Scottish National Investment Bank, kind of not looking to private consultancies to guide them that might not be aligned with the mission of the bank, because the mission is its primary purpose. So ultimately, I think this is one of the most exciting developments we've seen in Scotland, and I hope that it's going to be really harnessed to drive the type of kind of economic trajectory that we want and that we need just now. And I think having, and just to go back to what I said at the start there, you know, I think that's a really good recognition in terms of the kind of role of intervention and what that could do as part of an industrial strategy that actively seeks to decarbonise our economy, that protects labour rights, that creates good, decent, secure jobs, and fights for climate justice in the process.
Thanks, Miriam. That's a really good answer to my question. Thank you. Thanks for all three of you for taking the time to speak with us. It's been really good. I'm just going to invite everyone to maybe make a little closing remark. I'll invite you in at the end, Miriam, in case you want to come back in. But Stuart, do you want to say some final thoughts?
Yeah, just firstly, thanks to yourself, Connor, and the others involved in organising the event. It seems quite timely. And thanks to everybody for putting up with my ranty ramblings. It's a bit learning, and this seems quite real. there are still sections of the trade union movement that will ask for dirty jobs almost at any price, particularly if they're nationalised and unionised. And that doesn't seem like a fair enough trade-off to me, because what I've learned is that others pick up the impact of that. So I'm going to go away and think about that. And then I'm going to go away and think about how we resist Freeports, because they are a pig in a poke. Somebody said about the environmental damage, more ships in the Tay, but we don't even know if it's more ships in the Tay. It could easily just be more containers on the road just as easily. So we need to be wise to that. And our city needs a vision of the economy. And I'm liking this idea that that vision of the city should be up about opening up policy space. And I'm pinching Katie's ideas, but linking the loopholes to transformation. I like that one thing becomes another. It's ambitious. It calls on our idealism and our imagination, but that's okay. We just need to make that concrete. So that's what I'm off to start, and to try and learn to rant less and maybe ramble less as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. Katie, do you want to have some final thoughts?
Sure. Just thanks for having me, and if I come again, I'll be more prepared. I'm glad that Miri got this Scottish National Investment Bank question covered, because she certainly knows a lot more about it than me. But I think some of the frustrations maybe that have been expressed about the Scottish National Investment Bank also point to a wider thing that this is contextualized in, right? Like that there's a bit of a gap right now between the rhetoric that we're hearing about the direction that we want to go in from the Scottish government, and where the delivery of that is heading. And I could speculate for days on why that is, but we're on this call because we think it could be something different. And if we do, then I think that showing and holding our representatives accountable for the promises that they make, but also by directing them to the ways that things could be done differently. We don't need to have a corporate-centred approach to these questions. We could have a people-centred approach, and there are a variety of policy tools to get us there. I agree that these things are massive opportunities for the taking, and I think that sadly it's probably going to take a bit of a organising and public push to make sure we get over the line. So that's me saying that, and I'm not in Dundee, so that's so sorry I won't be there to organise with you.
Thanks, Katie. And Miriam, do you want to add anything just at the end?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's this huge moment of uncertainty just now, kind of compounding issues of Brexit, of an economic downturn, and there is a real danger in that moment that public policy kind of regresses back to kind of doubling down on some of the worst aspects, some of the most corrosive aspects of status quo. And I think Freeports are exactly that. It's a very short-term strategy to try and do something that it's never going to achieve. And I think that's why conversations like this are especially important, around hopefully trying to demystify some of trade investment, but also around kind of building alternatives to that, recognising that there is imbalances in our economy, but also kind of where do we step in and how can we help steer that in a different direction. I also want to quickly apologise to Katie for calling her an hour and a half before this and telling her that she should do it, but she's been great. I think we can all agree. So it was a good call. And listen, yeah, thank you all so much for all the engagement and the brilliant questions and for having me. It's lovely to see you all.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone here will join me in saying thank you so much to Miriam, Katie and Stuart for taking the time to speak with us. It's been like a remarkably well-informed discussion, and I think the points that were raised about trying to demystify questions of trade and investment, I think this has done more than any other hour and a half that I've been in to do that. When this is on YouTube, I'm going to be sending it to everyone I know. Just to quickly add at the end, we are having our next Radical Independence Dundee meeting next Wednesday, 2nd of December at 7 o'clock, and we'll be able to have a chat about, what speakers we might want to invite in the future, what discussions we want to have, and what kind of action we want to take. But again, thank you so much for all our speakers, and I look forward to seeing the rest of you in a week's time.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.